Of course, you see Sam Altman going to testify and he wants a licensing regime. Of course, OpenAI will get a license. Of course, OpenAI's competitors will not get a license.
Yeah, of course.
So if you're OpenAI, and you've now secured billions of dollars in investment in fundamentally these transformer models and the kind of hardware stacks that are specific to replicating them, and you get something that's out of left field, or you get something that's limited by a different factor that's not limited by the advantages that OpenAI has over its competitors. Maybe FOOM is not the sound of AI accelerating, but FOOM is the sound of OpenAI's stock going to zero. This is no longer a battle of like internet shitposters. This is a battle of real political interests and the forces that drive the Democratic and Republican parties.
Mm-hmm. I also love that it's done such a good job of getting rid of these useless grifters like artists and writers, because honestly, they had these pointless degrees. They were a huge, I think, cause of our society's degradation. And I'm so glad that AI has replaced them.
Oh my God. There's a real thing underlying that, is that like mid is over, right? And here, like actually mid. I don't mean.
Would you like to know more?
Hello, everyone. We are very excited to welcome Brian Chau for this episode of Based Camp. We're going to be talking with Brian not about his amazing podcast From the New World, but rather a new venture of his, which is called the Alliance for the Future.
So I think that the number one thing to understand is that it's a non-trivial question whether you are able to use machine learning, whether you are able to write machine learning, whether it will be illegal to log on to, chat.openai.com. That is a real question that people have different answers to, that many people want for various reasons to ban machine learning pretty much wholesale. And this is, the purpose of Alliance for the Future is to do everything we can to make sure that does not happen.
So what are you saying to the AI apocalypticists who start immediately screaming at you and flailing when you say things like this?
What's your take on Eliezer Yudkowsky's positions, and how do you respond to them?
Yeah, it's very funny. This is very often the first question that people ask me when I mention this.
Well, yeah.
And they're, striking the rogue data centers is among the, I think, the less, the less dangerous versions of what people are trying to get. Like this is something that maybe I don't know. Like there are people in AFTF, in Alliance for the Future, that I'm more worried about the EAs. I'm friends with many EAs, and I've also seen the kind of regulatory environment in Washington, in other countries, in the EU. The EU Commission are not EAs. The Chinese government is not EAs. Chuck Schumer is not an EA, right? I just don't think they're the major threat. They're like the closest thing to like a non-retarded version of the ban AI argument, and that's why they get engaged with in like smart parts of Twitter. It's because they are kind of like the smart representatives of this much bigger target of people that I think most EAs would consider like stupid and misguided. So I don't worry too much about the EAs. I don't want this to be a conflict between like EAs and like accelerationists or whatever. I think that's very silly. That's getting caught up in like
what I'm asking is even our audience, we've got, I suspect some people in our audience who think AIs are going to kill us all.
A lot.
Not a lot, because we've taken very hard stances against that. Well, so I don't know if you know our position on AI. We take a position about variable AI risk, which is very different than absolute AI risk. But I'm wondering, what is your stance? Like, if you're trying to calm somebody down who's like, yeah, but it looks like genuinely, I don't see how we remove this threat without restricting access. How do you communicate to them?
So there's actually a difference between like Eliezer and like fans of Eliezer. With fans of Eliezer, I just worry that they're driven too much by the current hype cycle. They saw that it's cooling down a bit. They saw, like GPT-3 get released, and then they saw GPT-4 get released, and they were like, what if it just keeps developing at the same rate that between GPT-3 and GPT-4 was released? And of course that did not happen. that was, that was the accumulation of lots of work and, the effort across the entirety of OpenAI's existence. And there are many technological factors that just slow development. This is the trend you see, is that you see, like an accelerating technology, you see it get adopted in early market versions, and then you start to see that the speed of that development petering out. I actually have a more specific argument going through all of so far I have the hardware part done. This has been put on the back shelf a bit because of everything else I'm doing right now. But I do think the first part of the article actually holds up very well in the past few months, which is diminishing returns on machine learning 1. You can find that also at fromthenew.world. From the New World, it is the home of everything now, everything that I do. And yeah, so to those people, I would say you are severely estimating the progress in artificial intelligence. Many of them have, they have this like I did not come up with this word. They came up with this word of like foom, which is basically like the idea that, it goes foom. it sounds like this sounds like a straw man version of the argument, but it is actually their own argument that, once it starts accelerating, it will just become, extremely fast. It will only get faster and faster. It's like this is just not, this is, this is hype cycle fantasy. In terms of like the longer term,
Explain of the longer term, why it's hype cycle fantasy. And this is the mainstream
just look
view.
At
yeah,
it's not the mainstream view. Like maybe it's like maybe it's the view among like Twitter posters,
like EA Zoomers. I know, like they genuinely, and I don't mean to be. We've tried really hard not to insult specific people on this show, but Eliezer Yudkowsky is the Greta Thunberg of AI apocalypticism.
No, you have to have the Straussian reading of Eliezer, right? So the Straussian reading of Eliezer. So like the surface level reading of Eliezer is that like he just wants to create, massive panic and for government to take control of everything. That's what he writes in his Time article, pretty much.
It is.
This is like not even really an exaggeration. So like the Straussian reading of Eliezer is, like he doesn't actually think that the world is like 90% that the world is like absolutely doomed, but he thinks that like no one will take it seriously, right? He thinks that unless you turn the volume, everyone's wearing earmuffs, so you better turn the volume up to 100, and you better give, and this is, by the way, like not necessarily an incorrect model of how the government works. Like this is what Fauci did as well. The reasoning was, that you wouldn't give us power to do any pandemic prevention measures unless we took very extreme positions on how dangerous the virus was, on how confident we were about certain interventions. And, in terms of the politics, Fauci was correct. Like, that was actually correct. He got the power. It's very likely that he would not have gotten the power if he made, like a moderate case for the risks of COVID. And I think Eliezer has learned that lesson. So I don't know, like maybe so like I think Eliezer is like not as insane as it sounds. Like the things that he advocates for are like truly insane, but like I think like Eliezer the man, is not necessarily that insane.
So your argument is just he's wildly overcorrecting, and that in reality AI is not going to accelerate as quickly as everyone thinks it is, and therefore as AI more linearly develops, people can develop safeguards as necessary. Therefore, it doesn't present an existential risk, and therefore we shouldn't be stifling its development with regulation and rules. Is that correct?
Yes. So it's mostly correct. So, and I should say here, I'm speaking for myself, not for like the AFTF in general, but. So like the original version of the name of the original version of EA that cared about AI was long-termism. And the reason why it was called long-termism is, the idea is that in hundreds of years, humanity, if you just look at, population growth, or like, I don't know, you guys have a much more pessimistic version of this, right? But if we create a way to solve our population growth problems and have the Earth continue growing, then the number of humans in the future are just much more than the number of humans in the present. So you have to care about the long term. And in terms of the long term, in terms of the time frame of like hundreds of years, I am not, I'm not completely sure that AI will not be a problem in like 100 years. That is something, that I accept as a possibility. The question is, if you have a pace of technological growth that is, what you would infer from every other technology that has ever existed, pretty much from, like the history of technological development, from, early science to the industrial revolution to more recent cycles, the 2000 cycle, the very recent, like 2020 to 2021 cycle of technologies. You get that you get this very well known thing called an S curve. You get an early acceleration and then it peters out, and then that's where the hard work has to be done, actually getting the technology adopted in all of these sectors of society. And this is also like the mainstream economist view. And I'm not like this, like the thing is, this is the mainstream view, right? The mainstream view is that, hype cycles happen, that technological progress is good, but it is not necessarily something that should be, that you should go all in on, right? You should invest in some tech stocks, but you should not, gamble your entire life savings on one tech stock, and so on and so forth. So I really do think this is the implementation of the normal, the normie, like non-hyper online position on technology as policy. That's how I would put it.
So
Okay.
Functionally, your organization, if it succeeds, what's it doing? What specific changes does it make in policy? How do you achieve those? What research are you outputting?
So Alliance for the Future is a completely new think tank. The number one thing is just to balance the scales, because right now there is a lot of funding either from the EA side, although I don't think that's the main problem, but even more from existing political interests. And of course, you see Sam Altman going to testify, and he wants a licensing regime. Of course, OpenAI will get a license. Of course, OpenAI's competitors will not get a license.
Yeah, of course. You always want to increase the barriers to entry. Actually, so this is a thing that you're talking about briefly here, but I really want our audience to understand this. So in the business world, what you want to do to maximize the value of your company is to advocate for regulation. Like, a lot of people are really surprised that like Google would advocate for like internet search regulation, or like, but this is what you see with any large monopoly in a space, is they spend a huge chunk of their revenue advocating for regulation of their own company. And the reason they're doing that is because it prevents new entrants from entering the market, which protects their monopoly. That is why people like Sam Altman are advocating for this regulation. It's not because they're genuinely scared of AI. It's because they're the first players on the market. Continue.
This is actually a very important topic. Okay, like this is a good venue to be like very autistic about this. So there is this, I think like he published most of his stuff in the 60s, 70s. Economist, considered one of like the founding people of political economy, Gordon Tullock. Okay, all the GMU people love this guy because he was from GMU, I think. And he has this idea called the Tullock rectangle. And that idea is that, okay, you look at, if you looked at a supply and demand curve, when there's regulations that interfere with the supply and demand curve, it can increase the profit of an industry that is being interfered with, because it stops, and essentially like the number of new customers, or like the amount of increased profit from these regulations outweighs the amount that you lose from missing out on some trades. But the way that I really want to see this expanded is with firm dilution, and not only with firm dilution, but with dilution of the entire industry. So what do I mean by this? In an industry like machine learning, you have basically you have a precedent that people are not sure is optimal. So you have, right now we have transformers pretty much. We have this paper from 2017. There have been minor modifications to it. The paper is called Attention is All You Need. And this basically outlined the way in which all language models and many similar models operate. And we don't really like, it's the best we got so far, but it's not like a mathematical proof. It's not like a certain thing. We have no idea if this is the best way to do machine learning. And in fact, many of the people who are more hyped about AI think that, we're just about to get another breakthrough in how we do machine learning. And So if you're OpenAI, and you've now secured billions of dollars in investment in fundamentally these transformer models and the kind of hardware stacks that are specific to replicating them, and you get something that's out of left field, or you get something that's limited by a different factor that's not limited by the advantages that OpenAI has over its competitors. Maybe FOOM is not the sound of AI accelerating, but FOOM is the sound of OpenAI's stock going to zero.
Actually, to this topic, just a shout out for listeners, because I have a little request from a friend here. I know of this company that's found a way to create like much better using neural models, like much tighter chipsets. Anybody who's interested in investing in like a large fab, like large, I'm talking, many millions of dollars, but that can make AI much less expensive to run. I've got a company that's interested in doing that right now. They've already developed all the stuff. They're just looking for whoever they work with on the space.
Oh, this is fascinating. So this is like not an OpenAI competitor, but like a TSMC competitor or something like that?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Another thing I wanted to dive into is, before we started recording, you had alluded to this not being really an EA style think tank. And I thought that was interesting because you are trying to be effective in your altruism through doing this, right? Like, So tell me more. Why do you think this is not an EA thing?
So like on the Center for Effective Altruism homepage, they have like this essay about like who is an effective altruist, and they basically say like everyone who wants the world to be better and who likes evidence. And I'm like, okay, I guess it's an EA think tank. Sure, give us money. Of course, most EAs want more regulation even in the short term. Or actually, I'm not sure, but like the people who are most funded by EAs, that's what they want. I should say as well, this is an article that might be out by then, but there's also a very strong EA case. Even if you think that I say this as well, like, the more you think that AI is happening soon, the more it's the Flight 93 election. The more you should be trying to make sure that there is no government control of AI. Because there is one institution in all of human history that is guaranteed to be misaligned, and that is the most powerful government in the world. Why is that institution always guaranteed to be misaligned? The answer is political economy. It goes back to Tulloch. It goes back to many of the factors we were talking about. But people have the idea, in markets, there's externalities. In markets, people will compete. And the thing that makes them succeed will not always be the thing that's best for the general population. And, when it comes to elections, the thing that makes people succeed in elections, the thing that makes them get the most votes is always going to be the thing that is, most rational and sane. And of course, this is not true. And you go further down the level, right? So there are these like there are these layers of the onion as you go down like the policy making stack. And people don't transfer their lessons. So I think many EAs, maybe they've read like Brian Kaplan, they might even have read Garrett Jones, and they understand the flaws of the voter. They understand the flaws of when you go and cast your ballot for Donald Trump and Joe Biden, that's not necessarily the best thing, that they're not necessarily going to be doing the best thing for the world. But you go one level down the stack to the legislative level or to the administrative level, and they do not see the exact same incentives in play. Where when you pass a bill, for example, when you pass like the authorization of the use of military force, right? Or when you pass when you pass like the budget, the budget reconciliation bill, what factors go into play in terms of getting your policy priority into that bill? And in what ways will it be corrupted by the process, by the requirements and the incentives for it to be there in the first place? And the short answer, this is something very funny that I posted about recently and got a lot of support on Twitter for, is that like there are some ideas that are so correct that even the most strawman version of them is true. So like the extreme strawman version of my opinion is like, or of this, like, it really, like, not my opinion originally, but like the field of political economy, the extreme strawman of it is that like whatever idea you want to get into law will be unrecognizably corrupted once it is in law. And even that like extreme strawman is like pretty much true. you just look at like
I like call it an extreme straw man. You're like, this is what my opponent's like, but it's true, even the most insane of them.
yeah, that's the best thing about it, right? Like even the most fervent supporters of law, you ask them, like, what do you think this law will look like after it's passed? They'll say like, I don't know, I just hope this is also like a take that I want to like specifically address if we're talking about addressing EA takes, is that I've had multiple people that I really respect say like, oh, we want the government to interfere because it will just slow down progress. We just want it to like cause harm. And as long as it's like causing harm, it will reduce the probability or the speed that we get AGI. And this is also something that I don't necessarily think is true. And the best counterexample in recent memory is gain of function research, right?
Mhm.
So we have this phrase called like anarcho-tyranny. Usually people talk about it in the context of SF, which is like the bad actors are not punished because they're outside of the system. The only people who are punished are like the good actors in the system, right?
Yeah.
So you're punished for like protecting your convenience store, but like the people who rob your convenience store are like rewarded by the state. And you see the exact same thing in regulatory capture. You see the FDA, very, very. You guys actually have had experience with this, right? With going after novel technologies that have some promise, but they will also, this is not the FDA, but the U.S. government will also fund gain of function research in Wuhan. So
Yeah.
the question is not, this like one singular lever of what it does to the industry. It is much more of the question of like how it influences the distribution of players. And the most likely thing that will happen with the distribution of players is that, oh, actually it's just OpenAI, Google, Facebook, so on, or not really a so on. It is really much just in this case, in some regulatory capture cases there are more, but in this case, it is really just like the major named players.
So let's say that you are successful with this beyond your wildest dreams. How will the world be different? Is it a scenario in which rather than there being like three players who are setting the tone for AI, it's a little bit more distributed, like a lot of people are contributing, it's more open source? Or what kind of environment or ecosystem are you trying to create?
So many people, this is a very fascinating critique of political economy, because if you look at these incentives, they rarely ever change. There are cases of just being like a doomer, of people saying like, not an AI doomer, but people like saying, oh, like the regulatory crackdown is inevitable.
Mhm.
But you just look at the history of the United States, and that's just not true. The best example is, you guys remember SOPA, like the stop, or like something like online?
Yes, when
Yeah.
they were trying to stop
Oh
the
my
internet nonsense.
God.
Yeah.
Yes. Wow.
So like this was a case. I think it was I forget which agency there was. Some agency was trying to pass. I forget the exact name of it, but it may have been, okay, whatever. But basically they were trying to do this restriction of content on the internet, basically saying that like if any like random commenter said or like linked to porn or something like that, then it would be then the entire website would be subject to legal crackdowns.
Right.
And people just wrote in, people got media attention. It became like this huge like unification of the internet was one way that it was described, where basically unanimously everyone was like, this is a terrible idea, this is just disastrous, and we stopped it. We had a W. And there are instances where there are calls for regulating an emerging industry, and for one reason or another, it just doesn't happen. You can look at the internet, for example. This is in the broader history of the internet. Mark Andreessen actually gave me this example, right? So Mark Andreessen, like he talked about this on my podcast. He's been on several others, but it should be out by the time this releases. And he talked about like nowadays, like what if you try to ban the internet now? We've created a successful political constituency. If your industry is big enough, which I think machine learning will be, I think even though we won't get, artificial general intelligence, we will get, many commercial applications. We have many
Yeah.
commercial applications now, right?
Yeah.
And once all of those are adopted, once all of those are, regular parts of people's lives, if it's big enough, like the internet is, and like I think machine learning will be, then you've created a political constituency. All you have to do is wait for the existing adoption curve to happen.
So
And then
you're saying that you're trying to broker that transition to like get to a place where adoption is wide enough where like the market will handle the protection because they are dependent on it and huge fans
right.
of
It's
machine
not even the
learning.
market. It's just, like if half your country is using ChatGPT or using some form of LLM,
Right.
you're not banning it. I'm sorry,
Yeah, like no one will get reelected if they support any legislation that does that. So basically, before that saturation has been reached, you are trying to ensure that we don't preemptively make that impossible, right?
Yeah, now is the most important reason for now is the most important moment for exactly that reason. Is because it's the only, it's the period of time in which it is most politically vulnerable, but
Yeah.
has the most economic potential.
Yeah, that's meaningful. Are you concerned about all the people? Because it sounds like you're not really fighting against EAers who are making weird arguments against AI. You're more fighting against legislators who are like, well, but they might have much more what you might say like normie arguments against it, right? So they're going to say, well, what about
Yeah. So
the
like the
fact that AI is
funniest
going to
thing,
take jobs away? What are you going to say to them?
I want to take an interlude between this. Most of the people who are actually proposing like these like legislative crackdowns
Yeah.
are very anti-EA. They are anti, like one of these people like Timnit Gebru, who is like this race grifter who is now like focused on machine learning, is they like she absolutely like despises EA for like honestly like pretty pathological reasons. Like it's not helpful for her in any way to dislike EA. Like they could easily be like legislative allies, but she like but she just absolutely despises them. Loves calling them racist because they believe in IQ and they believe in like
okay, so that
genetic
general
engineering.
approach.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, like a lot of the most despicable people like also hate EA, and like this is it's no longer just this is no longer a battle of like internet shitposters. That this is a battle of real political interests and the forces that drive the Democratic and Republican parties.
And what's your rebuttal to their arguments though? Because those aren't EA arguments. So what is your rebuttal to this is going to take away jobs? It's dangerous and we don't need it. So why should we support it, etc.?
The jobs point is particularly interesting because it's kind of like framed as a Republican concern, and it's very funny. It actually relates to the other discussion that we've had, or the discussion in the future that I have some premonitions about. Yeah, in many cases, AI, the things that AI are replacing are kind of bullshit jobs. They're things that people already dislike. People do not. There's this wonderful tweet by Sam Altman that says, today I've had one person tell me that they've used ChatGPT to expand their bullet points into a long corporate email, and another person tell me that they've used ChatGPT to condense a long corporate email into 5 bullet points. It's the future of communication.
No, yeah. But I also love that it's done such a good job of getting rid of these useless grifters like artists and writers, because honestly, they had these pointless degrees. They were a huge I think cause of our society's degradation, and I'm so glad that AI has replaced them.
There's a real thing underlying that is that like mid is over, right? And here like actually mid. I don't mean
mid is over. I like that way of putting it.
It's very funny because people portray like the most famous people portray like Drake being replaced by AI. It's like, no, he still has interesting things going on. Or like Taylor Swift. Look at Taylor Swift's like ticket sales. Like she's not worried about this. The thing, like if the top, like the people who are actually contributing to the culture that we consume every single day, they're just gonna be fine. And in fact, they're going like the next generation. Sam Woods was on my podcast. He had this wonderful line, which is, "Your job's not going to be replaced by ChatGPT. It's going to be replaced by someone using ChatGPT." I think
Mhm.
that in the future, like the meta of art will be very much, and I think like the top artists today will be able to adapt. They have that kind of like entrepreneurial focus. Taylor Swift is once again a great example. Like I think she'll really enjoy playing, and her team will really enjoy using the new tools to discover like the frontier of music. That
But I think what you're
there's going to be
discounting
new
here,
things that people
I
never
think you're wrong
realized
here. I think
before.
people like
she
Taylor Swift
represents
don't
1% of people. Like the vast
hold
majority
on.
of people
Look
have
at
not done
Grimes.
anything.
Grimes has adapted.
Yeah,
Taylor
exactly,
Swift has
exactly.
not. I think that you are overestimating the competence and the aggressiveness of this top, 1% of society. And that for a long time they haven't been pushed out. Like Quentin Tarantino, like digital cameras come along, he's like, I'm not going to touch them. Even still, he doesn't do them. A lot of throughout most of our history, you've been able to get away with that kind of BS, that kind of arrogance. But I don't think you're going to be able to now.
Yeah,
But I
there
think we're
is,
also
there is the innovator's dilemma. I think you're right. Actually, I'll say more like I think that non-zero of the current top artists will adapt. In terms of like one specific one, yeah, like I'm not 100% sure that Taylor Swift will be, will be the one who is like, yeah, who is taking up all of these new tools. But I think that it will be, it will be a hybrid. That I'm very confident about. That the mainstream of art, the mainstream of culture, the mainstream of film, that those will all, it won't be completely AI generated. It won't be completely human generated, created from scratch. It will be some combination of the two. Just like we had digital cameras, people are adapting to digital cameras. We had the internet, we had social media. We now have a mix, right? You can think of Netflix as a mix between the original film model and YouTube,
hmm.
right? Garrett Jones has this amazing term like spaghetti assimilation, which is he uses this in the context of immigrants. So like Italians come to America and or like they come to New York and they make New York, they become more like New Yorkers, but New York's culture also, they start eating pizza and they start eating spaghetti. It becomes more Italian. And I think the same is true of AI. Our current culture will become more like AI. There will be, I think like Sam Woods put it best. The replacement of jobs is not really going to be, like vertical. It's not really going to be like people being completely replaced by AI. It's going to be a new skill set. People are learning to do something better, and the people who will do that better are going to be the people who use AI.
I think though that what's understated is that a huge portion of knowledge workers, and in that I include people like sales, marketing, writers, artists, designers, salespeople, like website people, have been doing work that isn't actually used. Like I think we've had this period of inertia where people are still hiring and paying and thinking that they need these people even before AI, and like actually not using the vast majority of work they do, and that there are busloads of graduating classes that believe that their job is to sit behind a computer and write strategy documents and analyze things, but not actually build or create anything. And that these people are going to get laid off. They're getting laid off in droves. They're not going to get rehired. They're going to have to figure out their own way. Do you think that those groups are capable of building new lives for themselves when they've been conditioned to do something that is completely different?
Like this, so this is an interesting question. This is an interesting like economics question, but I do want to like mess with the framing a little bit.
Go
I
ahead.
think like this is not that related to AI. This is like
Yeah, that's
related to
true.
low interest rates more than it is related to AI. Like
Oh,
it
interest
is kind
rates.
of like it is like these things happening in the same time, but like you could easily see a world where OpenAI just develops, or like all OpenAI and its competitors just develop and release everything like a few years earlier,
Yeah.
and we have AI being released to broader society in like a user friendly way at the same time as like the crypto hype bubble. What would the
Mm.
vibes be around AI then? If it's like the tail end of the lockdown, crypto stocks are going crazy, and then OpenAI publishes like current level chat GPT. What are the vibes then? And I think it will be a vibe of like just much more optimism. It won't be a vibe of like complaining.
right.
It won't be a vibe of like, and of course, this is not really an argument for my position, but it's an argument against, I think it's an argument against much of the contemporary. This is like not the EAs, right? I think the EAs would still be worried. But for like the people worried about jobs, for the people who are worried about, like automation, for the people who are worried about, basically collapse, I think that that's much more kind of absorbing the more general economic environment than it is an actual concern about AI.
Yeah.
Well, what I like about your view is that it's actually quite optimistic, which is super not Gen Z. Like, I really like that. It's eminently reasonable. It's like, actually, this problem will solve itself. We're going to have the critical mass of machine learning users, essentially, that are going to make sure that it doesn't get, walled off and made very difficult to open source and, collaboratively develop. I'm just going to help to bridge the gap with this. And I think that makes me super intrigued to see how it goes for the Alliance for the Future. I'm really glad that you are in its foundational team and doing this work. And I'm keen to see how it goes.
If you're interested in this, check out the Alliance for the Future. Check out Brian's podcast as well.
Yeah,
yes.
affuture.org is how to find us. We would really, really appreciate donations at this early stage. And yeah, you can check out all of my writing. You can check out my writing on AI specifically at pluralism.ai. And you can check out all of it, including the podcast, at fromthenew.world.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's always really fun to talk with you.
Awesome. This was very fun. It was not, it wasn't 4 hours, but it was,
See, we don't have attention spans for that. We're like fast, but that's how we go.
Yeah.
Hey, you guys were on the podcast for 4 hours.
So for people who want to see our podcast with him, we talked to him for like 4 hours each, and I was hammered when I talked to him.
Completely hammered.
He got me at like 9 a.m. at night, going on until like 1 a.m. in the morning. It was enjoyable.
But it was more like, I think it was like 3 until 8 p.m. But for Malcolm, whose day starts at 2 a.m., that is like extreme.
No, it was late. I
late.
went past midnight, I think, was recording.
It went pretty late. I don't think. Yeah, I'm not sure if it was midnight.
In my brain, it was past midnight. We'll see.
Okay.
But
yeah,
our viewers, check it out. He has a great show. He really knows how to pull things out of people.
Yeah. You elicit amazing questions. You're an amazing interviewer. So yeah, check out From the New World, but also the Alliance for the Future. Thanks again, Brian.
Yes.